Welcome aboard, and welcome back to The Drowned History. Today, we're beginning a journey into one of the most remarkable polar stories ever told. The rise, the triumph, the tragedy, and the final resting place of the legendary ship Terra Nova. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where in the world are you watching from? Let me know your country in the comments. It's always incredible to see how far our voyages reach. Now, settle in, relax, and let's drift back in time.
The story of Terra Nova does not begin with disaster. It begins with ice. Thick, relentless, crushing ice. The kind that splits weaker ships like firewood. But not this one. Built in the late 19th century, Terra Nova was forged with a singular purpose: to challenge the most unforgiving waters on Earth. Its wooden hulls were layered and reinforced to withstand the grinding pressure of polar seas. Its decks were hardened by decades of storms and whaling voyages. And its name, Terra Nova, meaning new land, whispered of discovery long before it ever left a harbor. But a ship is more than timber and iron. A ship becomes a legend because of the men who sail her and the places she dares to go. As the world entered the heroic age of polar exploration, humanity pushed farther toward the Earth's frozen edges than ever before. Nations competed, explorers dreamed of glory. The poles, silent, white, untouched, became the ultimate test of courage, endurance, and human ambition. And among all the vessels that carried these explorers toward the unknown, none would become as famous or as tragic as the Terra Nova. For this ship was witness to more than storms. It was witness to hope, desperation, scientific triumph, and one of the most heartbreaking expeditions in exploration history. Today, we trace her journey, not only as a ship, but as a symbol of what humanity dares to chase, even when the ice itself stands in the way.
Long before Terra Nova carried explorers toward the frozen edge of the world, before it became a symbol of endurance and tragedy, it was simply a ship under construction, built not for fame, but for survival. To understand its later legacy, we return now to its beginning. The Terra Nova was born in 1884 in the bustling shipyards of Dundee, Scotland, a city known for one very specific craft: building ships that could fight ice and win. Dundee's shipbuilders were experts in producing vessels for Arctic whaling and sealing. These were not gentle voyages. They took ships into brutal, freeze-over seas, where ice could crush hulls like paper, and storms could swallow entire fleets. Any ship meant to survive had to be something extraordinary. And so, the Terra Nova was designed with one purpose in mind: to endure what other ships could not. Her hull was built from thick oak, layered again and again, reinforced with Scottish larch, the kind of wood that flexes instead of shattering. Every plank, every beam was chosen to absorb pressure from moving ice. Her bow was curved and strengthened to ride up onto the ice instead of being trapped inside it. Even her decks were double-layered, resisting the weight of snow and frozen spray. She was not elegant. She was powerful, a worker, not a showpiece. And that was exactly why she became legendary. As she entered service, the Terra Nova quickly gained a reputation across the northern Atlantic. She fought through ice fields that stopped other ships cold, She returned from voyages that many captains called suicidal. Seal hunters and whale crews spoke of her as if she were alive, a sturdy, stubborn creature that refused to break even when the sea tried to crush her. Her thick hull didn't just survive the ice, it thrived in it. She could push, grind, and force her way through frozen barriers where the water itself felt like stone. By the turn of the century, captains considered her one of the toughest wooden ships ever built, a vessel worthy of the most dangerous seas on Earth. Throughout the late 1800s, the Terra Nova spent her early career in the Arctic, hunting seals and whales in the frigid waters around Greenland and Newfoundland. Her crew often battled blizzards where visibility dropped to nothing, weeks of darkness in the polar night, and ice floes that shifted like massive drifting continents. But voyage after voyage, she proved herself. She returned home battered, scarred, scratched by ice, yet unbroken. Every journey sharpened her reputation, a ship that could withstand the polar extremes where others fell apart. These experiences, harsh, unforgiving, relentless, shaped her into the vessel capable of supporting one of the most ambitious polar expeditions in history.
By the dawn of the 1900s, the Terra Nova was no longer just a whaling ship. She had become something more valuable, a proven ice warrior. And soon, the world of exploration would come calling. A new mission awaited, one that would forever etch her name into history. By the dawn of 1910, a familiar name once again stirred the imagination of the British Empire: Captain Robert Falcon Scott. A naval officer turned national hero, Scott already carried the legend of his 1901 to 1904 Discovery expedition. But this time, his ambition was larger, more defined. He wasn't simply returning to Antarctica to explore. He was returning to win. Scott's dream was the South Pole, that blank, untouched center of the Earth no human had yet claimed. To him, this was more than scientific pursuit. It was destiny, a chance to cement Britain's place at the forefront of exploration, a chance to etch national pride into the white silence of Antarctica. But if Scott was the mind behind the mission, the Terra Nova was its heart.
When the British Antarctic expedition began planning, there were many vessels available across the empire, but only one ship stood out. A vessel with a history of brute survival, a reputation carved into ice and storms, the Terra Nova. Her thick hull, reinforced frames, and proven resilience in the Arctic seas made her the natural and symbolic choice. She was a ship built not just to endure the polar world, but to defy it. Throughout 1909 and early 1910, the Terra Nova was transformed. Shipwrights swarmed over her decks, fitting new equipment, strengthening her masts, adding laboratories, storage holds, sledges, scientific instruments, coal bunkers, and provisions, enough to keep dozens of men alive at the bottom of the world for years. In many ways, the Terra Nova expanded beyond being a ship. She became a floating laboratory, a mobile fortress, and a lifeline to a continent that could swallow men whole. By June 1910, the preparations were complete. Cardiff, Wales, Scott's chosen departure point, buzzed with excitement. Thousands of people lined the docks and crowded rooftops to witness history in motion. Newspapers called the expedition Britain's bold answer to the world. Children waved flags, bands played, and Scott, standing tall in his naval uniform, embodied the pride of an empire that believed nothing was impossible. At 3:45 p.m. on June 15, 1910, the Terra Nova slipped away from the harbor, her black hull gliding through the water, her rigging creaking softly in the wind. Sirens blared, the crowd roared, And Britain watched as the ship that had survived the Arctic now carried their hopes toward the frozen South, toward glory, hardship, and a fate none of them could yet imagine. The voyage south began with the Terra Nova pressing into waters that grew colder, darker, and more hostile with every passing day. What started as a triumphant departure from Cardiff quickly transformed into a test of endurance, one that only the hardiest ship and crew could survive. The North Atlantic greeted them with storms almost immediately. Winds tore across the decks, walls of water smashed over the bow. The Terra Nova, though strengthened for the polar world, groaned under the strain. Many aboard later described the first weeks as a constant battle against the sea. Men were drenched, shivering, and exhausted. The ship lurched so violently in the waves that sleep became a luxury. But they pushed on, because beyond the storms lay the white unknown. Life on board settled into a rhythm, though never an easy one. The crew lived in cramped quarters, constantly damp, constantly cold. Below decks, cargo was lashed tight. Mountains of food, kerosene, coal, ropes, tents, spare sails, frozen meat, and scientific instruments packed into wooden crates. The ship also carried its strange and essential passengers, 34 dogs and 19 Siberian ponies, each vital to Scott's plan for reaching the pole. The animals struggled with the rolling seas, and the men tended to them day and night, knowing that the fate of the expedition rested heavily on four-legged shoulders.
Despite discomfort and hardship, there was a sense of purpose, almost a quiet excitement. Around the galley table, men swapped stories. Some played cards. Others wrote in journals, describing what it felt like to chase a dream across the world. Scientists performed observations, even at sea, taking water samples, noting bird migrations, recording temperature drops as the ship crept toward the Antarctic Circle. And then the first signs appeared. Stray pieces of ice drifting past, a colder wind, a sharper horizon. The world turned clean and silent. Soon, Terra Nova entered waters choked with bergs, towering cathedrals of ice, glowing pale blue under a low sun. The crew watched in awe as glaciers the size of small countries drifted around them, creaking like ancient bones. Everything felt slower, quieter, as if they had sailed off the map and into a world untouched by time. At last, after weeks that felt like months, they sought the coast of Antarctica, a jagged line of mountains rising from a continent that seemed more like another planet. Snow whipped sideways in the wind, the air bit at their lungs, but there it was, the place Scott had dreamed of, the place the Terra Nova had been born to reach. The first landing was not triumphant, but humbling. The silence was overwhelming. The cold was unlike anything they had ever known. And yet the men stepped ashore with a profound sense of hope. Here, at the edge of the world, they believed they could make history. They didn't know yet how much this land would demand from them, or how deeply its white emptiness would shape the fate of the Terra Nova. The years that followed would cement the Terra Nova expedition as one of the most remarkable and heartbreaking chapters in the history of polar exploration. After establishing their Antarctic base at Cape Evans, the crew split into teams. Some focused on the science, others prepared for the long, deadly journey south. But every man, whether scientist or sailor, lived under the same brutal conditions: relentless winds, sub-zero temperatures, and endless white stretching to the horizon. Antarctica was no place for human beings, yet here they were, determined to uncover its secrets.
Despite the cold, despite the exhaustion, the scientific work never stopped.
Teams documented new species, studied glaciers, measured the weather, and collected geological samples that would later reshape our understanding of Earth's history. On the darkest days of winter, when the sun vanished for months, the crew still performed experiments by the weak flicker of lantern light. They took ocean samples in howling storms. They hauled heavy equipment across ice fields in temperatures that froze exposed skin in seconds. It was a triumph of human curiosity, a reminder that the expedition was about far more than reaching the South Pole. But survival itself became a daily experiment. Food was rationed. Frostbite and exhaustion were constant threats. The ponies began to weaken and die one by one despite the men's best efforts. Dogs collapsed from cold and hunger. The ice groaned at night like a living creature. Tents ripped in blizzards. Supplies froze solid. Sleep, when possible at all, was shallow and uneasy. Each day felt like a negotiation with Antarctica. Let us live one more day. In November 1911, Scott and his polar party set off toward their ultimate goal, the geographic South Pole.
After months of trudging through ice, dragging sledges by hand after the ponies and dogs were gone, and pushing their bodies beyond anything imaginable, the team finally arrived at the pole on January 17, 1912. But instead of triumph, they found a black flag snapping in the wind. Roald Amundsen had reached the pole first, over a month earlier. Scott wrote in his diary, "Great God, this is an awful place." The return journey became a desperate fight for survival. The men were starving. Their bodies were breaking down. The weather turned against them in ways even Antarctica had not shown before. One by one, they fell. Oates walked out into a blizzard, sacrificing himself so the others might live. Wilson and Bowers collapsed days later. Scott, trapped in his tent by a storm that never ended, wrote his final words, "For God's sake, look after our people." He died just 11 miles from a supply depot that could have saved them. In 1912, the Terra Nova returned to Antarctica to pick up the expedition teams. Instead, they found the tragic news recorded in Scott's diary, retrieved from the frozen bodies. The ship, once a symbol of hope, now carried home the story of unimaginable loss. Scientists, sailors, and officers stood on her deck in silence as they prepared to return to the United Kingdom. They carried with them thousands of scientific samples, journals, photographs, and the weight of a nation's grief. When Terra Nova finally sailed into British waters in 1913, the crew was met not with cheers, but with somber respect. The world already knew. Scott and his team had become heroes, symbols of bravery, sacrifice, and the human will to push beyond the edge of the map. In the years that followed, the Terra Nova's name became inseparable from the legend of the expedition. Not just a ship, but a witness to triumph, discovery, and one of the greatest tragedies in exploration history. When Terra Nova returned from Antarctica in 1913, she was more than just a ship. She was a symbol of courage, sacrifice, and the final chapter of one of Britain's greatest polar expeditions. But the world kept moving, and so did she. After the ceremonies faded and Scott's story became legend, Terra Nova was quietly sold. A vessel that had carried explorers into the heart of the planet's coldest frontier was now heading toward a very different life. Terra Nova was repurposed for sealing, fishing, and supply missions, work that was far less glamorous than polar exploration, but every bit as demanding. Her wooden hull, strengthened by decades of ice, was perfect for harsh northern waters. Crews admired her almost instantly. Even sailors who had never heard of Scott could see that this was no ordinary ship. They said she moved differently, that she sliced through rough seas with the confidence of something that had survived Antarctica and returned to tell the tale. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, Terra Nova adapted to a new rhythm. She carried cargo, transported people, fought through storms, and served remote communities.
There were no headlines anymore. No photographers waiting at the docks. Just honest, grinding, everyday work. But to those who served on her, the ship still felt special. Her decks creaked with history. Her masts groaned with memories. Every scar in her wooden frame hinted at past battles with ice, wind, and time. By the late 1930s, Terra Nova was aging, and the world around her was changing fast. Steel ships were taking over. Machines were replacing manpower, and the once mighty wooden titan of the Polar Age began to look like a relic of a forgotten world. Yet no one dismissed her. Even in her final decades, Terra Nova was respected, spoken of with admiration and a kind of quiet affection. She had earned it. Few ships had lived so long. Even fewer had lived so boldly. Her post-expedition years may have not been glorious, but they revealed something just as meaningful. A truly great ship remains great, even when the world no longer notices. By 1943, Terra Nova was an old ship, weathered, worn, and carrying more stories than any vessel of her generation. But she was still working. Even after 60 years in some of the harshest waters on the planet, she pressed on, now serving the war-driven supply routes near Greenland. It would be her final journey. In late September, Terra Nova found herself navigating the frigid waters off Greenland's coast. It was familiar territory, but she was no longer the fierce, unbreakable ship that once fought Antarctic storms. Age had taken its toll. The ice that year was thicker than expected. Sheets of pack ice crowded around the ship, tightening with every gust of Arctic wind. Sailors reported the sound of grinding, that deep, icy thunder only wooden ships know. Terra Nova pushed forward, as she always had, but the ice pushed back. Then came the moment. A massive pressure ridge struck the hull. The impact was sudden, sharp, like a heavy fist slamming into the ship's side. The planks groaned, splintered, and then water began pouring in. Flooding spread quickly below deck. The crew scrambled, pumps roaring, men calling out orders into the cold air. But the ocean was faster. Terra Nova was losing her battle. Realizing the danger, the captain sent out distress signals. Short bursts of Morse code cut through the Arctic silence, reaching nearby stations. The message was simple, desperate, unmistakable. We are flooding fast. A rescue vessel responded. With the ice pressing in and the water rising, the crew had no choice but to abandon the ship they had trusted, many of them for years. One by one, they climbed into lifeboats. No one died, but each man knew what it meant to leave Terra Nova behind. After the crew was safely removed, the ship remained afloat, battered, quiet, drifting among the gray ice floes. For hours, she fought against the water, filling her lower decks. Then, as evening settled over the Arctic Sea,
Terra Nova began to list. Her bow dipped first, sinking slowly with a tired kind of grace. The stern rose for a final moment, as if taking one last breath of polar air. And then she slipped beneath the surface. No explosion, no dramatic break, just a calm, silent descent into the cold, dark water she had braved for a lifetime. The Arctic closed over her, leaving only ripples on the surface. Ripples that faded within minutes, as though the ocean were gently covering the story of a ship that had served far beyond what anyone had ever expected. Terra Nova was gone, but not lost. Her legacy lived on, in exploration, in memory, and now in the icy depths where she rests.
For nearly 70 years, Terra Nova rested in silence, hidden deep beneath the Arctic, sealed under freezing waters and drifting ice. Her story was known, but her final resting place was only guesswork. A ship with such history, such legacy, deserved more than a fading mystery. And then, in 2012, the ocean finally gave up one of its secrets.
The Schmidt Ocean Institute, armed with modern technology and driven by a sense of historical duty, set out to search for Terra Nova. Using advanced remotely operated vehicles, ROVs, designed to withstand crushing pressure, they swept the seabed near Greenland, scanning for anything that resembled the legendary vessel. It was a search not fueled by treasure, but by respect, by curiosity, by the hope of closing a chapter that had remained open for generations. After hours of scanning vast stretches of dark seabed, the ROV's sonar captured something unusual, a long, symmetrical shadow, too shaped to be natural, too familiar to ignore. The ROV descended, lights cutting through the blackness of the Arctic deep, and suddenly, there she was, Terra Nova, sitting upright on the ocean floor, as if still waiting for orders. Researchers were stunned. Despite decades underwater, Terra Nova was astonishingly intact. The bows still recognizable, the structure still proud, the wooden hull still holding its form against time and pressure. Even artifacts and fittings remained visible, quiet reminders of the men who lived, worked, and suffered aboard her. It was as though the sea had preserved her out of respect, refusing to let such a ship decay into obscurity. When the first live feed reached the surface, the research crew fell silent. Some watched with a sense of awe, others with emotion, knowing exactly what this ship meant to polar exploration, to British history, and to the story of endurance. A few team members even described the moment as like meeting an old friend. The Terra Nova had been found, not destroyed, not forgotten, but waiting patiently beneath the ice. Finding the Terra Nova was more than locating a lost shipwreck. It was validation of the heroic age of Antarctic exploration. The triumphs, the sacrifices, the pursuit of knowledge at any cost. It tied the past to the present, from Scott's era of wooden hulls and starving ponies to an age of robotics, satellites, and deep-sea research. And it ensured that the Terra Nova, a ship woven into the very fabric of exploration history, would continue to be studied, honored, and remembered. She may rest beneath the Arctic now, but her story continues to rise to the surface, one discovery at a time. In the quiet depths of the Arctic Ocean, where sunlight fades into a cold and endless blue, the Terra Nova rests, untouched, undisturbed, and unforgettable. Her timbers may be silent now, but her story continues to echo across generations.
Terra Nova's legacy is not merely about a shipwreck. It is about what that ship represented, what it endured, and what humanity dared to attempt upon its decks.
The Terra Nova sailed in an era when exploration meant facing the impossible. There were no satellites, no GPS, no rescue helicopters, only determination, wooden ships, and the bravery of those who believed the unknown was worth pursuing. She carried men who willingly stepped into the most hostile environments on Earth: blinding blizzards, shifting sea ice, starvation, isolation, and temperatures that could freeze skin in seconds. Yet those men went anyway, because behind every great discovery is the courage to keep moving forward, even when the world turns against you. Terra Nova became a symbol of that courage, a vessel that pushed the boundaries of what humans believed they could endure. To many, Terra Nova is more than a ship. It is a floating memorial to Captain Robert Falcon Scott and his companions, who paid the ultimate price for the dream of reaching the South Pole. Every plank, every iron bolt, every tool once carried the weight of their hopes. And the wreck, lying peacefully beneath the Arctic ice, still carries their memory. It stands as a reminder of their scientific achievements, their relentless determination, their heartbreaking final journey across the endless white, and the message Scott left behind: for God's sake, look after our people. Terra Nova is their final monument, preserved not in stone, but in the cold embrace of the sea.
Few relics from the heroic age of Antarctic exploration survive intact. Most have been lost to time, to decay, or to polar winds that erase history with snow and silence. But Terra Nova remains, frozen, preserved, almost perfectly intact. A rare window into a time when wooden ships dared to challenge the world's harshest frontiers. A physical link to a chapter of human history defined by grit, sacrifice, and the pursuit of knowledge. As we reflect on Terra Nova's story, one truth becomes clear. The polar world is not an enemy, but it is unforgiving. It respects only those who understand its power. It rewards few, challenges all, and reminds humanity of its limits. Terra Nova's fate is a lesson carved into the seabed, that exploration is never just about discovery. It is about the risks we take, the lives we honor, and the legacy we leave behind. And so the Terra Nova sleeps beneath the Arctic ice, a monument to ambition, a memorial to sacrifice, and one of the last great relics of an age when the world still had blank spaces on the map. Her story may have ended in 1943, but her legacy continues to guide and inspire everyone who dares to explore the unknown.
As our journey comes to an end, we return once more to the silent, icy waters where the Terra Nova rests. Down in the dim Arctic depths, far beyond sunlight and memory, the ship lies undisturbed, as though time itself chose to freeze around her. She is not simply a wreck. She is a ghost, a quiet echo of another age. An age when explorers pushed into the unknown, armed with nothing but wooden hulls, wool clothing, and unshakable determination. An age of courage, sacrifice, and the belief that some discoveries were worth any cost. The Terra Nova carries all of it still. Her timbers hold the weight of triumph and heartbreak. Her broken masts whisper the names of those who never returned. Her hull, resting in cold eternal darkness, preserves the final chapter of a ship that served until the very end. Even now, decades after she slipped beneath the Arctic ice, you can almost imagine her creaking in the darkness, as though she remembers the winds of Antarctica and the voices of the men she carried across the world. In her stillness, she reminds us that history is never truly lost. Some stories continue to drift beneath the waves, waiting for us to listen. And tonight, we have listened. Thank you for spending this time exploring the Terra Nova, the courage she carried, the lives she shaped, and the legacy she left behind. If you'd like to continue your journey into the mysteries of the sea, I invite you to watch one of my personal favorites next: 10 Most Mysterious Shipwrecks Ever Discovered. A deep dive into some of the strangest, most haunting wrecks ever discovered beneath the oceans. Until then, stay curious, stay adventurous, and may the sea always whisper its stories to you.